This is the story of a young boy born in Paducah, raised in Milwaukee, who would one day join the Army, excel as a highly respected doctor, raise a family, and become a well-admired friend and colleague to many people. This little story will give you a glimpse of what drives him to be the man he is today.
I was born in Paducah on February 1st, 1927, in McCracken County. Believe me, I can remember next to nothing about Paducah because I left there when I was about 2.5 to 3. I kind of remember a gal that was helping to take care of me, a black lady named Callie, and she apparently was an important part of my life at that time. Moved up to Milwaukee when I was about 3, and my dad and mother, my dad got a job in an insurance brokerage company, and he stayed in the insurance business in Milwaukee until he died. These are great folks. They both came from Berwyn, Illinois. My dad was an engineer. He graduated from the University of Illinois in engineering school. My mother, lovely Irene Frances O'Brien, she graduated from the University of Chicago in home ec. And they had great parents. I was really lucky because all my grandparents lived until I was well into my 20s. So and they were an important part of my life and my family's life. My mother and my Nana and Papa, Ori Chamberlain, lived in Berwyn, and he worked somewhere in the Loop downtown in the accounting department for what eventually became Sears. And then my grandfather O'Brien, Nana and Papa O'Brien, lived across from the park in Berwyn. He was city manager of the waterworks in Berwyn. The things I remember, the things that my sister doesn't remember. She suggests that she was sort of my maid at the behest of my mother. And I don't remember that at all, but maybe she probably was forced to do some things because she'd always say, "Jack's studying, be sure you take care of this, make his bed," that kind of stuff. So I don't know. In any case, we were close, and I shouldn't say loving any of it together, but we were close and did things together. Never had a lot of money. None of us had a lot of money in those days, but had enough so that we were comfortable. When you don't have very much, you don't know it different. So at that time, none of us were spoiled, and I don't think I spoiled my kids, even though I was a little more fortunate than my dad and mother, economically. But they took good care of us. My dad, along the way, when the war came along, he joined the Navy Air Corps and was in Washington, D.C., in the Air Corps. Never was an actual pilot, but he was in management area. He was a captain. And then my mother was just a lovely lady who took good. She was she stayed home. She wasn't a working mom. She stayed home and took care of us, and she was always there for us all the time. My sister, as I mentioned, lives about a mile from where we're sitting right now in the summertime. I had a brother. My brother, Bob, lived here in Northbrook. After he finished it in Milwaukee, he also went into the Navy during the Korean War, and was an officer. And then he worked for IBM. He was a unique guy, in a couple of ways. And now I should bring that up. He was the only one of 2 people that I ever knew who could read and talk backwards. And he was so unique at that. And it wasn't a fake, because you'd say, "Well, let's write that down." He'd write it down. You put it in front of a mirror. You could hear this was what he just said, or he wrote. There it was. You put it in front of a mirror. Bingo. He only knew one person in his life. It was that fellow he was in high school with, named Paulson, who was able to do the same thing. And they'd talk to one another to the dismay of all of his pals. But he was a pretty much of a genius, and did very well with IBM and then in the banking business. But unfortunately, he died at age 65 about of a lymphoma, and it was a tough death, and we miss him much, as his family does. The only thing that I remember negative about my mother, everything else was positive, because she was everything a person would want in a mother. The only thing negative really was a positive, but I remember when I was in about 5th grade, she was head of the PTA at the time, Parent Teachers Association, and she all of a sudden I found that I was no longer in the class with all my buddies. I was to start the next semester in September, and here I was in a new class in the same school at St. Robert's. And what's going on here? Well, what it was is a class I was in before had a teacher, Sister Mary Doris, who was known to be a mean old lady, and who would slam kids up against the wall and all the rest of that stuff. And my mom obviously didn't want me to be with her, so all of a sudden I find myself and it's the only time in her life I think she fibbed. I said, "Mom, did you do this?" And she, "Oh, no." But indeed, later in life, she admitted that she was the one. Through from the age of about 7 through 14, I would go to, in the summertime, I don't want to say my parents farmed me out, but maybe they did. They said I went up to a farm just west of Port Washington, between Port Washington and Connellsville, about 25 miles north of Milwaukee, and worked on, I was on this dairy farm from age 7 through 14, and just loved it up there.
Officer Jack would soon find out how the impact of one event can change the course of history, and how his path to his dreams would some days hit bumps, but he would always manage to get back on course.
I can't really say I ever really enjoyed Army life. I couldn't, once the war was over, I couldn't wait to get out. Like all of us were anxious to get out, because but when the war was on, that was a different story. The war was still on, and but they sent me down and some of my friends down to Texas A&M in the Army program, and they sent me this time to chemical engineering. Well, I thought, whoa, no thank you. And I had another pal of mine, Mort Chambers. He and I were close buddies, and we both went up to the company commander down at Texas A&M and said, "We want out, send us back to our old infantry outfit." And he said, "No," he said, "this is where the Army wants you." He said, "Well, we don't want it." We said, "How do we get out?" He said, "The only way you can get out of here is you fail." Well, we both didn't, neither of us turned in examination papers for the next 6 weeks, but it took us 6 to 8 weeks to get out of there. I was in the infantry down in Camp Maxey, Texas, and this was right about the VE time, but we thought the war in Japan was going to go on forever at that time. And so I was all gung-ho to win the war all by myself. And so I applied for and was accepted into Officers OCS and the paratroopers in June of 1944. And at that time, something that was very stirring was my mother's sister, Aunt Dottie, was married to Bill Morgenstern, who was vice president of the University of Chicago and head of public relations. And Dottie, and we were always very close. Dottie and Bill, as the rest of our uncles and aunts, were close, but they particularly. And she heard through my mother that I was going into paratroopers. And so she wrote me a letter, and she said, "Jack, the moment you've read this letter, you got to promise me to burn it." Now, I couldn't tell this story 30 years ago. I can tell it now. But at the time, she said, "Got to burn this letter." They lived right across the street. They lived in a log quad at the University of Chicago, which is right across the street from Stagg Field. And if you recall, Stagg Field is where, underground, they developed the atomic bomb. And the higher-ups were never told as much, but they knew something strange was going on. And the scuttlebutt around there was that this is such. So in this letter, my Aunt Dottie said to me, unless you want to, she said, I know you got to, if you go into Officers OCS in the paratroopers, you're going to have to stay for 3 years. You have to sign on for 3 years regardless. And she said, unless you want to stay on and as an officer for 3 years, she said, I just tell you, don't do it because we have reason to believe the war is going to be over this summer, which was within the next few months. And indeed, so I was close to her and believed her, and indeed didn't want, if the war was going to be over in a few months, I didn't want to spend another 3 or 4 years in the Army. And so I withdrew my application to the paratroopers, and indeed, 3 months later, the bombs were dropped in Japan, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was and it was over within a month. A real good captain, who I became friends with, said, "You know, you've got enough points to get out." He said, "Are you sure you really want to wait around another month just to get that extra stripe?" I said, "I think so." He said, "No," he said, "don't. It doesn't make sense." So I said, "Well, let me see what I can do." So I called the dean at Marquette, where I'd started earlier on back in early 44, called him and said, "Do you think I could get back into pre-med? I know I'm a little bit late for the semester, but can you get me in to do it?" And he said, "Sure." So I got back to Marquette 2 weeks after the semester had started, had to catch up again. But because of that captain saying, "Forget about that last stripe, get yourself back to school and get going." So that's how that was important.
Knowing that his mission was set in the roots of something that happened when he was a small boy, Dr. Jack would soon excel to the highest pinnacle of his profession. But along the way, he would still maintain his sense of bedside manner, endearing himself to many.
I left high school a semester early because a friend of mine, Dr. Jim Shelby, who was at the time in the Navy program at the University of Marquette, told me that if you were in the upper 10% of your high school class, you could start college early because everything was accelerated then because of the war. And so I thought, well, let's give it a shot. And I went down and talked to the dean at Marquette, and he said, sure. So I left Shorewood High School after 3.5 years and went to Marquette University in pre-med. I'd wanted to be a doctor ever since I was 8 years old. When I was 8, I had rheumatic fever pretty severely, which is the only illness I really have had in my life of any significance. Matter of fact, I had 42 years of practice without missing a day at work. But when I was 8, I had rheumatic fever pretty seriously, and an awfully nice doctor, namely Dr. James Conway, was over to see me at home about every other day. They didn't put me in the hospital because my folks couldn't afford to put me in the hospital, but if I'd been that sick, they would have. But he took care of me at home, and I got through it without any problem. And in those days, rheumatic fever was pretty common because it was after strep throats and all kind of streptococcal disease, and there wasn't any penicillin or anything around in those times to kill it. So some of us got rheumatic fever or scarlet fever or other complications of strep. But from that time on, I always wanted to be a doctor. Medical school is a big jump from college, just like college football is a big jump from high school football. Medical school is a big jump from college. The amount of studying that it requires and the amount of effort that it requires to get around these courses is monumental, incrementally. And so after I realized that I wasn't the dumbest guy in class and was able to do it and doing better than most of them, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed medical school immensely. I just ate it up because I love medicine that much. Well, I graduated when I was 24. It was a moving time. In those days up until about 25 years ago, you had to take a rotating internship after medical school, in which you spent a whole year on in different areas of interest in the hospital, and it was after that you made your decision as to where you wanted to go in medicine. Now, if I hadn't had this rotating internship where I saw everything, I would have become an obstetrician gynecologist, because I really liked that when I was a senior in medical school. But by the time I had had 3 months of it in training, I thought, I don't want to do this all my life. It just wasn't that interesting or challenging. So the most challenging to me was internal medicine. And so I decided after the year of rotating internship that I wanted to become an internist. And that's the most ubiquitous of all the various specialties of medicine, and I've enjoyed that very, very much. One of my most interesting jobs was I was elected chief of medicine in 1970 and had that for a couple of years, and then was elected chief of staff at Columbia Hospital, which is in charge of the medical staff, which is 450 doctors, and held that position for 15 years and enjoyed that very much. It was on top of my practice of medicine, but I enjoyed it so much, dealing with the doctors and dealing with the community, and it was a good time. I was the doctor for the executives of the Miller Brewing Company, and not only did I take care of them and become friends with them, but they also took me to 15 Super Bowls. We'd fly to Super Bowl City and for 3 or 4 days and play golf and watch the games and go to the NFL parties, and it was a good time. And then also, whenever they go to third world countries with their incentive programs, the top dealers around the country, the top 10 or 15 would go on these third world trips. And when they go to the third world, they'd take me along as a doctor. And as an example, to Kenya and Hong Kong, Japan, Beijing, etc. And fortunately, they let me take Lee along, my wife. And so we had a good time going to all these nice places, and with 5-star deals. And matter of fact, when we came back from Paris, we came back on the Concorde. And it wasn't a bad deal. A nice ancillary program going on while I was in practice. One of the awards, and that's in quotation marks, that I got was that the nurses at Columbia in 1971 voted me the Procto King of Columbia. And I guess you'll show that picture of proctoscopic equipment in the throne. But as a matter of fact, the reason I got that award is because I was doing more proctos than anybody else. And as a matter of fact, when I finished practice, I realized, I counted up because I kept track of all of them, that I'd done over 20,000 proctoscopies in my practice. That's a lot of rear ends. I really loved the practice of medicine. I had a marvelous practice in taking care of some of the finest people in Milwaukee, many of whom became close friends of mine as well as patients, and still are close friends, even though I've been retired now for 7 or 8 years.
Staying in tune with his highly competitive drive, Jack would hone those skills, involving himself in golf, fishing, squash, and much more. His dedication to keeping himself healthy is evident, but his inability to shoot his age in golf has become a temporary setback.
I got a lot of mileage out of skiing and golf, squash, tennis, hunting, and fishing. Went to Canada every year for about 10, 12 days. Always had dogs, so took them along and had marvelous things. And my boys were part of this business too, with the hunting and fishing. When I took up fly fishing about 10 years ago, after not having done so since I was a kid with my dad, but I've taken that up with a moderate passion, and that's one reason why I belong to Fox Acres in Colorado, which is up in the mountains at 8,200 feet, and where we have 17 lakes stocked with trout. And so as a matter of fact, I'm head of the fishing committee there, and just very, very much enjoy fly fishing. And golf has always been a moderate passion. I was as good as a 7 handicap back when I was about 36 or 7 and 8, and have gradually gone up to the point where I'm about an 18 handicap now, which is a little disturbing, but thank God I can still swing the club and have a lot of fun doing it. One of the things that I remember particularly is going fishing up north with my dad, and he loved to fish. We'd go up to northern Wisconsin every summer and fish. We were never very successful fishing, but he constantly said, "Old mossbacks in that next weed bed, we're going to get him." Well, we never quite did get him, but I'll tell you later. Eventually did get him. This past about 3 years ago, when I was up north with Grant and John, and I tied into old mossback a 32-inch, 8-pound walleye, which Grant has on his wall in his rec room. My dad named him that. My dad was looking for old mossback all his life, and he never caught him. He waited till I could catch him, and now the kids, and Grant's got that up there, and on the bottom on the plaque it says, "Dad finally caught old mossback." When I was at the University of Michigan, they had a ranger over there from the Rangers from the English Army, who taught us a lot of tumbling acts and so forth to stay limber, but he also taught some of us who were interested jiu-jitsu. So I became reasonably proficient at jiu-jitsu. As a matter of fact, I taught a little bit of it when I was in the infantry. But since I got after I got out of the service, I'd only on 2 occasions that I ever used jiu-jitsu again, other than perhaps show somebody how to do it. But the first time was when I was home in Milwaukee on a furlough, and my brother, who while I was away grew about 5 inches, and I was about 6'1" to 2", and he became about 6'3", and was bigger than I was. He couldn't wait till I got back because he wanted to throw me on my butt. And well, I said, "All right, let's go in the backyard." 30 seconds later, he's down on his butt with my knee on his neck. He said, "That's enough." He never challenged me again. And the other one was always more serious. One day in the middle 70s, I was coming home from the office to my home in Shorewood. All of a sudden, this fellow who obviously was a thug cut me off in my car on Downer Avenue. And I told me to get out because he said, "Get out of the car." He said, I want to take care of you. I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you cut me off back about 6 blocks back." I said, "Well, if I did, I'm sorry." He said, "That's not good enough." He said, "Get out of the car." And I said, "Well, if you got a real beef," I said, "follow me over to the police station and we'll take it out there." He said, "No, you get out." So I started to get out of the car, and he banged my door against me as I got out of the car. I said, "Whoa." So I immediately, just reflexly, threw him upside down, knelt on his neck, and that was the end of that. All of us have some trophies on our walls, and so we have won one thing or another when we're particularly lucky. But the one that was most moving to me was the year after Christine died. I asked my brother-in-law to come to Milwaukee Country Club to play with me in the Jamboree, which is a big 3-day event, a member guest event at Milwaukee Country Club. And we were the oldest ones in the tournament. And it just so happens, I wouldn't be telling this story unless it had a good ending, he and I happened to win it. On the last hole, we won it by, I think, a half a stroke. And as we embraced on the green in front of a crowd of maybe 200 people watching this whole thing, as we embraced, I whispered to Webb, "Thank you, Christine." I'm sure she took care of that. I started to wind things down a little bit about 3 years before I retired completely. I would take 2 weeks off or 2 to 3 weeks off in November, and 2 to 3 weeks off in January and in March, and we would go to Palm Springs, the Palm Springs area, and that's when I joined PJ West. It was cheaper to join a club than it was to pay the outrageous green fees for all the different places, because we were very much involved with golf. But how lucky can a guy get to be able to play golf 5 and 6 days a week, both in the summer and the winter, in the best climates that you can imagine, and being where you can fish regularly and catch a lot of fish.
Jack's old world principles and role as a provider was an integral part in his family's life. And as the family expands to new generations, his values, passions, and character are being passed down today.
I really was about 10% involved in raising the kids. They had a tremendous mother who was really responsible at the 90% level of raising these kids. Now I had, needless to say, had some direction there, and maybe the final word on a lot of stuff, but she was the one who did the burden, and they, well do they know it. And Betty just died this past year, and the kids are still lamenting that. But she had a good death, and they're comfortable with their lives and with how it happened. We were up at the lake at our cottage, and I was asking her to help me, and the whole family was up there, and her husband at the time was there too, and I asking her to help me put rollers underneath the boat to pull it out into the lake, and she put them in crossways. And I said, "Christine, what are you doing? That's not the way to do this." And she sort of almost cried a little bit. And Kerry, her husband at the time, and still he is your husband, wonderful guy, he came up to me later and said, "Jack, never put Christine down in front of anybody again." And from that moment on, I realized she had one of the nicest husbands in the world, because he really looked after her, and we miss her so much. But Mary Beth is number 2, a wilder Indian by far than Christine. She had, and along the way, and bless her heart, she developed scoliosis, significant scoliosis, and she was put in the Milwaukee brace. But as a result of this Milwaukee brace to straighten out her back, which is the Milwaukee brace is where you've got to put this brace on and keep the neck up, and it's a tough deal. You got to wear it all the time. And but she did it, and her mother did it with her. It helped her through it. But I remember she became the star pupil and student of Dr. Blount, who was one who designed and developed the Milwaukee brace. And he always showed Mary Beth off in front of visiting doctors from all over the world when he was just demonstrating the Milwaukee brace and how to take care of people with scoliosis. And one of the things Mary Beth had to do when she was a young teenager, had to do push-ups and so forth in front of all these doctors from all over. And she had some holy shorts, some underpants and so forth that she had. And her mother was so embarrassed that there she was doing these push-ups with holy shorts on and holy underpants on. But she got through it, and she's doing fine now. John is also a little bit of a wild Indian, and a wonderful guy. Lots of stories about John, but I guess one that is memorable to all of us is when he and one or two of his buddies, we lived on the lake on a bluff above Lake Michigan, and he and a couple of his buddies, all of a sudden, the Shorewood Fire Department was called. Well, he almost set the whole village on fire because they built a fire on the bank, on the cliff, and the whole area caught fire. And so the fire department had to come and they caught him, and I think their mother had to pick him up out of the pokey to get, because they caught him when he was in high school doing this. just one of the things with John. He and I, won some golf tournaments together, and it was good. He was a good guy. Well, there are lots of stories about Nancy, and I had to pick out one. I guess Nancy was an achiever, a very bright and beautiful gal, but she was an achiever. Some of my kids they all went through college, and all of them, I went to maybe an average of 5 years to get through college, but Nancy went through in 3.5 years, which is rather unique. She went to Dayton, and she doubled up her studies and went to Italy for part of her schooling, and as a result finished in 3.5 years. So this was a real plus. Lots of Nancy stories, but that's one. We'll leave it at that one. Wendy's, I would say, probably is the hardest worker of all the kids. She went to McGill and got interested in cooking, and has subsequently. I want to say it's because I taught her how to cook when she was growing up, which is absurd. Her mother taught her a fair amount, but she got into cooking when she was up at McGill, and she's become a cateress over the years, and still does some catering and does a beautiful job. And she, between that and raising all those 3 boys of hers, she's had her hands full. Grant's the baby of the family, but he's also the biggest of the family by a good measure. I think John is 6 feet, 6'1", but Grant grew up to be about 6'5" or so, and I think the reason is that I always had a lot of dogs around the house. I always had Labradors, trained them and hunted with them, and the kids grew up with the dogs as well, but particularly Grant. Grant regularly would eat the dog food, and we had to do everything we could to keep him out of the dog food. But the crumble, was it hard? But we figure his height and his size is due to all the dog food he ate when he was a toddler, and even beyond the toddling age. He loved the dog food, and he loved the dogs. I had fallen away from any sorts of religion for 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years, till Christine got sick. And once it was obvious that she was really sick, I would go over to the old St. Mary's Church, which is only a block and a half from my office in downtown Milwaukee. I'd go there every day at 12:15 and go to Mass at noon over there. And from then, even after her death, I've continued to, don't go every day, but I go as often as I can, and it's become a very meaningful and purposeful thing in my life. And I'm hoping that my kids will find that more and more as they move along in their life. I'm not a major philosopher. My wife has a PhD in philosophy, but I have trouble keeping up with her. So I try to remain unpretentious in that area of interest, because I can be second-guessed too easily. But I just guess some important things are really to keep your eye on the ball, stay focused, don't get distracted too much along the way. That's if you want to become a success. You got to keep striving for what your ideals are, and not get thrown off on tangents too often. And keep family in mind always. I think that's terribly important. And it's not to say that I always have done that, but if I had anything to do over again, I'd spend more time with my family, and I'd spend more time with the Lord. And I'm the last one to be sanctimonious, but I think that's very important.
To the Iron Duke, thanks from everyone, and happy 80th birthday.